The role of metrics is quite simply to use or to have a view of a problem and a way of measuring against that problem towards a goal. So metrics are a way to communicate progress. What I often tell companies is you need to rack your metrics. RAQ.
I have an example with NPS, for example. People sometimes confused. They don't know what it means. They don't know ranges. They have to be educated on this.
It's a method of being able to determine what makes us stop something, what makes us pivot away from something, or what makes us invest in something. We don't really ask ourselves, is this worth building? And the longer we don't ask ourselves that question, the longer or the more expensive it is to change direction. What I want people to leave this podcast with, more than anything else, is the idea that tension, continually asking yourself, is this the right thing, is what drives great product. Everything that we're doing and discussing here is just a means to get there.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Lyoshin podcast. Today's guest is Adam Thomas. He's a principal at Approaching One Product Consultancy. Adam has over 15 years of experience building and scaling teams of product managers, marketers, designers, and product operations. And today I invited Adam to talk about metrics and product management, and also Adam's developed survival metrics framework. Welcome, Adam. Nice to have you here.
Happy to be here and excited about this conversation.
Great. Before we jump in, I just want to make a really quick announcement, or reminder rather, to all the listeners out there. So if you're liking this show and this episode, please like and subscribe. This really helps with the reach, and so more people can see this. As always, I appreciate your support. So, Adam, let's start with just generic metrics questions and overview. And first thing I would like to see is your opinion, and from your point of view, what is the role of metrics in product management, and how essential they are for short-term or long-term in the product world?
So I think the role of metrics is pretty simple, right? And I think we often overcomplicate it. The role of metrics is quite simply to use or to have a view of a problem and a way of measuring against that problem towards a goal. So metrics are a way to communicate progress. That is it.
I see. Okay, that's very simple, straightforward explanation. So then, from your experience, you've been in product for quite some time. How did you see metrics evolved over time, if at all?
So for companies that are smart in this stuff, I was very lucky. I started off at a company that knew numbers very, very intimately. The company was called DTCC, and the reason why they knew their numbers very well is because it may be the most audited company in the planet. And so I learned from them how important numbers are, because there, right, your numbers are checked, and rechecked. In fact, there are auditors that check those numbers, right? Internal auditors, external auditors. People are coming from all around to check to see if your numbers are right and if they tell the right story. And so starting my career there gave me a really specific appreciation for, one, how numbers can simply tell a story, but also, two, how numbers are, when focused, right, can tell a lot of information in a very short time. The reason why my definition for metrics is pretty simple is because working amongst those experts, it gave me an appreciation and an understanding that I think is missing when I hear a lot about metrics talk today. And so personally, my evolution has started with a place where numbers were really known and I was very comfortable with them, and moving into a different part of technology where numbers are often dismissed, right? People take numbers and think if they put up dashboards, or if they have a lot of them, or if they throw them into communications willy-nilly, that people will engage with them. But in the truth, they don't. Right? It leads to data blindness. And so my evolution started in a place where I knew numbers well. We've continued to a place where I saw that weren't a lot of number understanding or metric understanding. And these days, there are folks that teach this stuff very well on the product side, right? You have your Melissa Perry's, your John Cutlers. These are people that understand numbers and are teaching them well, but we're still a long ways to go for people to understand the role of metrics as a communication device that helps you communicate a problem and how close you are to that solution.
Yeah, I kind of see the same thing in organization where I work. Even though this organization is full of scientists, sometimes it's really hard to to pull out how exactly they want to measure things when we're delivering something. So that's very interesting. Looks like it happens in many places. So are there any tips or ideas from your perspective that can help organizations to become more data-driven, more metrics-oriented, or anything like that?
So what I often tell companies is you need to rack your metrics, RAQ. You need to make sure your metrics are relevant, actionable, and quantifiable. So the first step in that process goes back to the definition I used earlier. If a number is important, it should be very clear what problem is driving you to measure that number and what goal you're ultimately trying to measure while using that number. And if the problem's not important or the goal is not important, ask yourself, do you really need to be tracking that number? And so there's a lot of work that you can do just off of that will shorten up the list of numbers that you're keeping track of, and as a result, help you tell better stories just because you have less numbers to juggle.
Yeah. Maybe sometimes for people it's also hard to figure out which one is the most important one. Like I have an example with NPS, for example. People sometimes confused. They don't know what it means. They don't know ranges. They have to be educated on this. And at the end of the day, in my personal opinion, NPS is not even that great. So, it could be that.
Well, NPS is a perfect example, right? What's the problem that NPS is solving? If I ask people that, they're often not going to have an answer for you, right? And if they're just honest, they're probably going to say, because the company of my friend measures it, or it sounds like a good idea, or they'll come up with some, right? They'll say, well, we're measuring customer sentiment. But if you dig into NPS, are you really measuring sentiment? Right? What you're doing is you're asking customers at random parts of their journey, would they share this? And because it's at random parts of their journey, we don't know what the last thing that happened to them is, right? So we have this, detractor 0 to 7, neutral 7 to 9, or 7 to 8, and then promoter 9, 10. But as I've done NPS surveys in the past, the thing that would always make me go, what? Is you would get people that would put 10 and say, I hate this, right? If you ask them why. Or you'll have people that would put 0 and they'll say, I love this and I promote it with my friends, but I got a bug just now and I'm very frustrated, right? Which would tell you the person that you're asking has no context on what you're asking them anyway.
Yes.
So how are you using this as a number to track anything, right? And then on the other side, what goal? What are we trying to do with this number? Even if we had a bunch of promoters, what is it solving for us?
Yeah.
Do we have a referral goal? Maybe if you're in marketing, maybe, if you put a range, if you put constraints around it, if you tell a story around that NPS with that, maybe, right? I'd interrogate it more, but there's a point there, right? We're focusing on referrals. But as a general business metric, what does that even mean?
Right.
So, even now we just did that push pull. I call it the push pull, to understand the relevance of a number or a metric, right? Just there, within 2 minutes, right? I can tell you why MPS isn't worth it for you. And if you're using it, why you should probably move over to something else. Figure out what your problem is, and then figure out what goal you're trying to reach when you're measuring it. And that will also help with priority, by the way, because if the problem's important or the goal's important, we can have a conversation. If they're both important, well, we probably really should be measuring this. And if neither is important, then why are we measuring it at all?
Right. So what are some of the biggest challenges that you've seen? Maybe people have defining metrics and measuring them, or maybe from your experience, some specific metrics that you found especially difficult to track.
Well, that's a tough question because that's really context dependent, right? Like, how do we track it? Well, do we use a vendor that tracks it well? Do we have experts there that can build something that'll help us track it? Do we have data scientists available? Do we have some sort of artificial intelligence that might help us with some of the sorting and cleaning? Right? What's our data integrity look like? Right? There's a whole bunch of questions I'd have to go down the list, which might make something that seems very simple hard to measure, or something that might seem hard to measure very simple to measure, depending on that company's data hygiene and how they think about measurement and success. So that's a tough question to answer. I think in general, when I think about difficult metrics, I think about how specific you can make a metric. And if you can get to a level of specificity, which is really hard, it's really hard to find the exact thing you need to measure. But if you're very clear about the problem and you're very clear about the goal that you're going after, the work it takes to find a better metric and a better metric and a better metric, and one that's super specific, pays off dividends. But it's extremely difficult, and you need to, it's really important that you dedicate the resources that are required to do it, right? It's not a walk in the park, and it takes a lot of time.
Makes sense. Yeah, it is a tough question with a lot of background that I probably should have provided. Okay, so let's move on to the survival metrics framework then. And can you just explain what it is? What is this framework about?
So survival metrics was born out of me working at a SaaS company after layoffs, trying to figure out what's important and what wasn't. And survival metrics is a way. It's more a method, right? It's a method of being able to determine what makes us stop something, what makes us pivot away from something, or what makes us invest in something, and how we can create those metrics that really tell a clear story about those things. And so for companies that are looking to understand what should make us be proactive, what can get us from a reactive state where outside forces are forcing our hand in terms of changing direction, to inside state or a proactive state where our decisions help lead us to better and better outcomes, survival metrics is a tool for you to help do that.
So it helps not only measure things, but also have those exact points in time where you should make a decision to stop, pivot, or continue investing more, basically.
Yes. Yeah. I look at it more as a way to, yes, it's helpful with the points in time, and yes, it's helpful with measurement, because just by doing it, you're going to have better, better data infrastructure and integrity. But I also look at it as a system that allows us to get our thoughts on the table and to be proactive with what I think the tension that is required for a good product to be made. Right? Far too often, we are reactive, which means when somebody sets a direction, we just go. And when we go, we don't really ask ourselves, is this worth building? And the longer we don't ask ourselves that question, the longer or the more expensive it is to change direction. And once you get past a certain point, well, it's going to be very difficult to change direction because we've invested so much into this, right? That's called sunk cost fallacy. Once we hit a certain point, our brains are more than ready to say, well, we have to see this through.
Yeah.
Then it ships. Then you have to maintain it. And then you have to build more features because you're not going to give up on it, right? On and on and on and on and on. This is a waste of resources, time, money, that if that was just on its own would be bad enough. But also think about what you could have built in that time. And so survival metrics is really underneath all of the tactical, practical, which I'm sure we're about to talk about as we continue this conversation. What I want people to leave this podcast with, more than anything else, is the idea that tension, continually asking yourself, is this the right thing, is what drives great product. Everything that we're doing and discussing here is just a means to get there.
Yeah, that's great. And when I first listened to your talk with this metric, and you gave us some examples and exercises to do, that's pretty simple. It makes sense. It requires a lot of communication, collaboration efforts, but I think overall it's a great tool. So yeah, that's why we're talking. Since you first designed and invented this framework or method, were there any changes to it? How did it evolve since the beginning?
Great question. It's funny. I think this is the first time I'm answering this, so I'm loving that I got this question. So one of the biggest changes that happened to survival metrics since I started it is the initial framework that that the person has to go through, right? There's some pre-work that someone has to go through in order to get to the right metrics, right? I call these the pillars of change. So currently they are strategy, right? How can we know where we're going, right? Directionally. There's being data informed, which goes back to the data hygiene, some of the questions that we've already talked about as as we talk about metrics, right? And the story that we're going to tell about those metrics as well, right? Also very important. And being politically safe, which you mentioned collaboration earlier. As a product person, we don't play individual sports, right? We're team players, right? There's no I in product management, right? And so we're constantly collaborating. So we have to have some understanding of the politic of the world around us. And if we don't, we are doing a disservice to the team that we're managing. And so at first, I mean, those are the three pillars as they are now. I didn't have strategy as a pillar before. I had speed, right? It was originally fast, data informed, and politically safe. And the reason why I had fast there is because one of the things I saw at Informed as a result of doing this was a really big increase in our velocity to deliver products, right? So we went to Informed was barely doing, a release a quarter when I started this with more people, right? They just had a layoff and things were really grim. They couldn't get things out the door. Then I got hired and we had to figure this out. We were doing things with less people 6-7 times as fast.
Wow.
Right. So less people, arguably less resources, less experience. So fast, right? I thought about speed at first, but what that doesn't calculate for a lot of teams is direction, right? Because I can give you a whole bunch of ways in which you can speed up your decision making, right? But if you don't have the right decision, or if you don't have a framework in place that helps you get to that right decision or direction, then you're going to run headfirst into a wall. And so I really made that change to strategy with some speed elements inside of it, right? So if somebody if somebody wants to do a long form version of the survival metrics workshop, right, will go 3 or 4 hours. And the strategy piece, you'll see the speed parts that'll come out of some of the strategy work that we do.
Mm-hmm.
That said, far more important to lead with strategy, though, because if I can get you looking in the right direction instead of going fast, right? I think this supports the for those listening, the strategy and direction support the data and the politics much better.
Yeah, I see. Okay. Well, that's good because that's how, like, at least in agile world, right? That's how they do it. Like you deploy something, you test it in real world, and then you adjust, and you learn something. In your particular case, with layoffs, and then maybe teamwork, doing things faster, but maybe not the most important things. So yeah, that's great. So what you mentioned, and there are some pillars and some steps in the process. Can you please walk me through those steps on a high level?
Yeah. So what is survival metrics? Let's get into the tactical practical of it. So survival metrics is a way that lays bare the tension that can help teams get over a sunk cost fallacy and make decisions with their products on whether to stop, pivot, or invest. And so I mentioned the pillars of change. There are 3 of them. First is strategy. As I mentioned, that's direction. And so when you think about strategy, it's really important that you understand 3 core things. One is, what is the problem that we are trying to solve? How are we going to solve that problem? Because without knowing what problem you're going to solve, you can't really set a clear direction. Far too many teams think about goals and solutions. Not really worth it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the first mistake. And the reason why I start with that is, if you get this wrong, everything else that we talk about may be helpful locally, right, in the short term, but long term isn't really going to move the needle. So what problem do you want to solve? How do you want to solve it uniquely? Right? Differentiation. This is also called guiding policy. And then what are the actions that you want to take to get stuff started? And so this is cribbed off of Richard Rumelt's Strategy Kernel. It's a great book called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy that talks about these 3 things exhaustively. And if you're thinking about strategy as a whole, it's a great book to pick up.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to get that squared away, most importantly. Next is being data informed. And with data informed, what you're fighting against is data blindness. Data blindness is when you have so many numbers that people don't pay attention to them. The other thing you want to fight is actually tracking things. But I think, funnily enough, I think it's easier to fight against data blindness, or easier to fight against not tracking anything versus fighting against data blindness, right? Anywho, when you fight data blindness, you want to rack your metrics, as I mentioned earlier. You want to make them relevant by asking, what problem are we trying to solve? Again, back to that problem piece. If we have that, everything else becomes downhill. What goal are we trying to accomplish? And then how are we going to accomplish that goal? The other thing is actionable. And so this is where our story elements start to take shape. What are we trying to do with the metric? What are the stakes involved? Right? When I say stakes, when you watch a movie, you don't necessarily care about the movie until something bad may happen, right? Because our brains are wired that way. We want to see danger. Also, our work is that way too. But the problem I find with teams is they don't communicate stakes very well. And so those stakes then turn into commands that people don't quite understand. And you can only lead by the fist but for so long. But if you told people, look, these are the stakes, this is what's happening. If we don't do this, that will happen. If we don't drop churn, right, we risk our ability to fundraise. Right? If you make things clear like that, right, people not only understand what's at stake, but they also may have ideas. Right? You're opening up people's ability to contribute, as opposed to telling them you do this in 2 weeks or else. And then 3, as an extension of that, you want to tell them what does the strategy, how does this connect to the strategy? How does this connect long term to what we're doing? And so that's how you make it actionable. The third thing is you want to make it quantifiable. And so this is where concepts like leading and lagging indicators come into play. Because we have metrics, and everybody has different metrics. But do those metrics connect? How do those metrics connect? So can you draw a metric map? How does churn tie into tie into revenue? Right? Lagging. Or, right, we can talk about leading indicators. How does product engagement turn into churn? Right? Or how does product engagement turn into win rate? Right? And so what you're doing there is you're taking the you're taking the numbers and you're making a story out of it, right? When you go talk to sales, if you just bring up product engagement, they're going to be like, But if you bring up win rate, and you can make that connection between product engagement and win rate, they're going to listen to you because they want to bring home more money to feed their families, right?
Yeah.
And so your ability to create that map of these concepts, right, will really drive a data-informed culture, because now you're telling people what these numbers mean. You're also telling them what's at stake. You're also telling them how it connects to their work. Right. So now your people feel more in touch with data, and they know what data to use as a result. Lastly, we want to talk about being politically safe. And so some folks may think about this as stakeholder management. I think that's a decent way of thinking about it. One way to think about stakeholder management is to draw a map of the organization itself, right? Not your org chart, but how decisions are made. Something as simple as just seeing and saying where your last decision went to die. What do these people think are important, right? These people that you work with every day gives you an opportunity to clearly tell the right story to the right people. It also gives you an opportunity to highlight places in which you can tell your story. You can communicate what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so these are the 3 pillars of survival. We haven't talked about metrics yet, right? These are the pillars, right? If you're doing these things well, this next part is going to push it to the next level, right? Even if you don't use this next part, if you take those 3 things I just talked about and do them well, you're in a good place, right? You're probably in a better place than you are today.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's get into survival metrics. The metrics themselves. When I brought up the definition of survival metrics, I talked about these metrics should make you act. And how they're going to make you act is they're going to make you either stop something completely, pivot, or invest. Now, all 3 of these are different states than the state of go, which your product is currently on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Go, business as usual. You're keeping the lights on. You're going through your ceremonies, whatever you do, right? Those 3 words mean you're doing something different, right? It forces a change. Now, how do you get those numbers? Well, you take what you've created with those pillars of change, and you want to translate them into numbers, right? And so these numbers have three parts. You have your action, which we already talked about: stop, invest, or pivot.
Mm-hmm.
You have your clause, which will be driven by your strategy, right? What is going to make us change? What are the things that make us change, right? we have these, we've talked to everybody, right, through our political safe stuff. We know what incentivizes them. There are red lines for the company. There are values for the company, right? These are things that should make us change. Let's lay them out. Let's make them very clear. Or there are things that make us want to invest based on our guiding policy or guiding principles, right? These are things that make us want to double down, right? We see a crack in the market, we want to follow through on it. So let's make that very clear. What are those things? Well, we write them down. And then you have your metrics, which are driven by your data informedness, right? Now you know the problem, right? You can go back and do that same rack your metrics with those clauses, right? What is the problem? What are the stakes? How do we connect this to other people and other teams, right? If you do this for the important metrics that you've got, for the important clauses that you've gotten out of those conversations, right? Now you have a list of metrics, right? You have a list of survival metrics that'll make you stop, pivot, or invest. After that, you want to prioritize them based on what's important, right? However you like to prioritize, there's a million ways to skin that cat, right? But if you're doing all this other work, what's important should be very clear. And it's important because you don't want to go over 7 metrics. This is where Miller's Law comes into play. Miller's Law being metrics. The human brain can remember 7 things plus or minus 2. And so it's important that you keep that list down because these are things that you're going to have in front of people, right? You're prioritizing them. Why do you want to prioritize them? Because you want to communicate them. And so this is where you inject those metrics on a regular basis to the team, right? Your sprint planning meetings are a great place to do so. Hey, everybody, just want to remind you, if you run into this, we're stopping. If we run into this, we're pivoting. The next time we meet, we're going to have a conversation about what we should do next. And if we run into this, right, it's going to trigger me and us to go talk to our leadership to go get more resources from somewhere else. I realized I did not, when I said that these are different than go, right? I really want to key in on invest here. Invest doesn't mean move forward. Invest means I am taking something from somewhere else and making the case that they need to give me more. Right? Which is a very different posture than saying this is a good project.
Yeah.
It's a posture of saying we deserve more resources. Right. And so it's the inverse of stop too. Knowing when to stop something. A lot of product managers are nervous about the stop because they go, what do I do? Right. If we stop, then that's my job. No. Right. Your job is to manage the resources that are there and to help the team make better and better decisions. When you stop something that does not match the company values, or you stop something that may break the law, or you stop something that may get you sued, you get the opportunity to work on something else. If your product leadership is smart, right, which is a whole other thing, but most product leaders I know, right, when I talk to them, and in my past as being a product leader too, if somebody came to me and said, this is useless, we need to stop it, I'm angling that person towards a promotion. Right. And if any PMs that work for me listen to this, right, they'll instantly comment and say, that's something that I've seen Adam do. Right. The reason why is I'm looking at you as a steward of our resources. You're saving us hassle. You're saving us maintenance costs. You're saving us time. Right. We have a vision that we're ultimately trying to get to. You're saving us time so that we can go chase that vision. And so investment is the inverse of that. Right. So you're helping us get to that vision faster. You're seeing something. You see, the classic invest story is his first name is Chamath. He's an investor. He's famous for the Facebook friend quotient. He figured
for the 7
out
friends or something.
Bingo. Yes. Right. He's the one that figured that out and said, we need to invest in this now. Right. That's the invest. Right. Imagine if he just said, well, let's just, it looks good. We're successful. I just won't raise my hand, right? We're missing on opportunity. There's plenty of opportunity that's missed.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's that. And so you're communicating those metrics back to the communication piece, right? We're communicating those metrics on a regular basis. And so much so that we know what the action is when we run into it. We don't have to think. We know what we're doing next. And as you do these actions inside of an organization, you're training the organization to get used to change, right? Not just change for the sake of change. There's change and there's reason behind the change. There's a story behind that change, right? Which allows you to build a pivot story. I didn't go over this during the talk, but this is more of the workshop, right? You go over what I call pivot story, where you're able to talk your stakeholders through what this change is, why you're doing it, what are the opportunities or scenarios that you're leading us down, right? These are other 3 things that are available. Let's pick one of these things. Or if you have a better idea, here's what I think should be, this is what should drive that idea. I'm open to having a conversation, right? If you come to stakeholders with that, again, that's something as opposed to saying, I don't have any ideas or I don't have anything, right? Now you're driving something interesting. Yeah. And so and then you iterate, right? Every month or so, you take a look at those metrics, see if they're still relevant, adjust and continue. And so that's survival metrics. You get your 3 pillars and you got your 4 steps and then off you go.
So yeah, that's a great overview. It involves a lot of communication from the beginning, defining the problem, documenting like solutions maybe or steps actions we want to take and things like that. Who are the key people to communicate with to gather that initial information?
The key people to communicate with, well, first is your team. I think as a product manager, this stuff works inside out best. So, and I tell people when they implement this, the place to implement it before anything else is your circle of influence. Every product manager has a circle of influence, right? You have your engineers, your designers that you work with, maybe a couple salespeople, who knows, right? You have these connections. Start there. And inside of that, you can still do all of these steps. All these steps are available inside of that small group. Yeah. So start there and then explore. I would also say, make sure you talk to your boss, right? Like, as this is going on, keep them aware, because that's going to help them.
Yeah, I would imagine if a new problem is identified, product manager will bring it up to the leader, and they will discuss it with the team. They maybe do some verification with customers, right? So all those steps may be in play. So another question I have is about this action to stop, invest, and pivot. Is it like encoded in the actual metric itself and saying like, if we get to X number or X percentage, we pivot into here, to this one or to that one? Is that how it works? Or you have to set up like a meeting, I guess, or something and pitch what we should do?
So, for stop, it's immediate, right? Which makes stops are very powerful because they are, they're going to tell you what your values are as a company. Especially if you tell people, if we run into this, everybody stops working immediately. Right. And what's next? Well, we'll figure that out. But one thing I have never seen ever in my 15 years of doing this is if we stop initiative, no one suddenly has any work to do, right? Like there's stuff, right? There's tech debt. There's a million things that's going on, right? If I told you you could drop this, you would like the engineering team or the designers would pick up, like there's stuff to pick up, right? There's always accessibility work, if nothing else, right? Like this stuff exists. So yeah, team. Sometimes I'll get the question of like, what do you mean stop? Everything's going to stop? Not really, right?
There's always backup plan.
There's always more work. As Michael Bungay Stainer talks about, right? There's always more work. For the pivot, right? That should set up a conversation because we're not sure. We still may want to continue on with this, but we want to make sure that this is the right thing for us to do. And so that's more of a conversation. The invest is depending on the culture of your company. Hey, go out and continue working. I, as the product manager, or I, as a leader, right? I'm going to go on a campaign, right? Like now, I gotta go pitch. And if this is a culture where this happens, then of course they already know, right? They already know what's coming. But if it's a new culture, right? Your job is to start to create the structure where this can happen.
Yeah. In the first view, when I look at this, pivot looks a little bit like stop, because it requires to like stop and then go somewhere the direction, right? Or maybe just make a turn. So the team, you're suggesting the team will just possibly continue, and then while the new decision is getting done, okay.
Yeah, because that's the difference between pivot and stop. Pivot is like warning, right? But it's okay if we continue.
I see.
While we figure this out, right? We're gonna. Hey, maybe one of the examples I use is, hey, our anticipated cost for AWS is a little high. That doesn't mean stop building the thing. That means we should have a conversation about this. Either A, we can talk about how we lower costs, or B, maybe it's worth it. I don't know. Let's figure out what would make it worth it, right? It's worth the conversation, but it doesn't mean stop, right? We'll just continue going, and the next time we get together in flow, we'll talk about it.
I see. Okay, just like a flag, basically, or something.
Yes.
Okay. And then something I wanted to clarify about political safety. You can you elaborate a little bit on that? You mentioned it's basically conversations with your stakeholders within the organization, just making sure everybody's aware and everything like that. Is that really what it is, or am I missing something?
So, when I think about political safety, it's having a understanding of these stakeholders, right? I think at the core of it, it's having an understanding of who your stakeholders are, what's important to them, what's interesting to them. Let me give a little more light. What's interesting to them, what's driving them. Because if you don't know that, then you're probably going to run into some landmines as you try to do any of this. And you don't want to create enemies, of course. The other thing that I want to stress about political safety is you need to create your communication cadence out. So, are you prepared for your next all hands? How does that look? How do we regularly communicate change? One way I used to do this is a newsletter for the company, right? I would have a PM do it, rotate amongst the team, and we would ship a newsletter at the end of the month. Not active communication, but it's something that people, if they're interested, they will keep in an internal newsletter. Will just keep people aware of what's happening. Enablement scheduling. How do we connect to talk about problems within the revenue organizations that exist?
Yeah, I see. Okay. Yeah. That makes sense. So we have a few minutes left. I know you have to run. Lastly, I just want to say or ask if you have any advice for anybody who'd like to adopt this methodology or method, and also if there are any pitfalls that you can caution people about.
Sure. So, advice. One, if you want to jump in on this, always feel free to email me, adam.thomas@hey.com. More than happy to answer questions, get some time on the phone with you, talk through what's going on. The second thing is there is a Miro board on the Miroverse. If folks are familiar
I
with
can
Miro,
link it here.
beautiful. It goes through the process very clearly. So before you try to do it, I would look through it and just try to see what you see, right? What are we deficient at? Where can we be better, right? What are we strong at? Usually I have folks, pick one of either strategy, data informed, or politically safe, right? Which one of these are we most efficient at? And that's where you want to start. You get yourself to a place where you're feeling good about it, and then you start bringing in your metrics. One of the pitfalls is trying to do this wide too fast, right? Don't try to put it in at your entire organization in one weekend, right? I know some leaders may get excited when doing this, right? I used to help folks with OKRs, very similar thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Leaders get very excited by OKRs. They try to implement them across the organization at the same time, and chaos ensues, right? With any framework, start slow. Pick a team that's healthy in all of these, as healthy as you can, and you have a good relationship, pretty strong. Start there, because if it's a weak team and they don't have a strong PM tied to them, right? They can drown here, right? Because I am aware I'm asking PMs to do some behaviors they may not be used to, right? They might be, some people call them Jira jockeys, right? People who sit in Jira all day and move tickets, right? Like if I tell you to turn around and just start talking to everybody at once, right? It's a big shift.
Yeah.
So you need to, we need to work ourselves up to it, to build the right expectations. The other pitfall is trying to do the metrics before doing the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can have all the metrics you want in the world. You just fall right back into data blindness. Because now you just have more metrics that people are going to ignore. And you don't have you can't validate why. These metrics are important.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks for your advice. And I'll link all these things in the descriptions so people can get access, and I'll leave your contact information as well. So
Outstanding.
Thank you very much for your time, Adam. It was a pleasure talking to you. And we'll talk sometime soon. Thank you very much.
Talk soon. Bye.
Bye.